this is the problem that I was speaking of earlier, that modeling is really good, really useful to us risk scientists in predicting what's going to happen if the event happens. But the probabilities of the event happening tend to be highly judgmental. So this is where the human has to come in. The machine isn't very useful at this point. And we're making subjective judgments. And we should be informed by the data, but we're having to be very theoretical about the future. So we don't want to fall into the induction fallacy, which Aditya and I have talked about before, which is the doomed turkey problem. So if you're inducing from past data, historical data, that's fine if theoretically you expect the conditions not to change. But we have to be very theoretical about the future, what the conditions will be. And in fact, normally, when we're put in the position of saying, what are the future contingencies, the stimulation is because conditions are changing. So we have to be very theoretical about that. And theoretical means being judgmental, and that's where subjectivity comes in. And then we can use some techniques like Monte Carlo, and we can do some structured group discussion about what the judgments should be. But I mean, that's inherent, right? I mean, I don't know, I should turn this into a question, Bill. Is robust decision making, what's the right word? Is it exogenous to this judgmental process?
No. Yeah. So I think to get at your question, Bruce, that the sort of this human part where we have to bring human expertise to bear is as we look at these critical vulnerabilities and come up with assessment with intervention plans and mitigation strategies that we think will cover the most ground going forward. And then also this idea of the trade-offs analysis, where we have to think through, as our policymakers to think through, it doesn't matter how clear the data is about something, is there are never out of context vacuum decisions, right? Like, we have to spend money and devote resources to a myriad of competing priorities. And there's also always our values, right? Like, there are things we can and can't do, or we will or won't do, based on what we believe is right. So we've seen that, we've had a lot of talk about that, right? Like trying to balance out public health concerns about disease transmission versus also valid concerns about economic growth and that kind of welfare. So these things are never push button decisions. They always involve human contextual expertise and judgment about what is best.
Yeah, let me just add something there, because Aditya and I have spoken about the modeling of COVID pandemics in previous episodes. And I'm eager to hear more from Aditya about this. But what you're talking about is a dispute about values, right? So this goes back to a dispute about values. So do you value human life more than the economic life, right? So that's one of the disputes in our policy response to COVID-19. So do we lock down everything and preserve human life as much as possible, or do we allow some economic activity and social activity, for that matter, for a whole separate value, which is socioeconomic values as a group? But I think there's a separate problem to that, which Aditya and I have talked about a lot, which is within the modeling of the human part of this trade-off, which is, unfortunately, it's not just a dispute about how much you value human life or economic activity. There are those horrendously huge disputes about what is the best epidemiological model of how pandemics behave. And so, Imperial College model, Aditya and I have spoken about this, turns out to be, has all sorts of software bugs and then some theoretical bugs, and God knows what else, because we don't fully have transparency on how that model was created. So that, unfortunately, that undermines our ethos as scientists involved in this, because the lay person, the general public, then looks at these disputes between scientists about what the right model is, and these exposures of failed models, and they just throw up their hands and say, well, science is just, it's all baloney. There's this knee-jerk response to think, well, instead of thinking there's good science and bad science, or there are flawed scientists, or there are just genuine misjudgments about what is a good assumption or a bad assumption. But it's easy for the public and politicians, for that matter, we've seen this too, to throw up their hands and say, well, all science is nonsense. It's all pretend. So in this current emergency, where there are tendencies for persons to just behave subjectively and ignore policy, ignore scientific advice, or to question authoritative advice and prescriptions on how to behave in the COVID emergency. Is there anything we can do in terms of our advisories to decision makers to help mitigate the inherent problem that we have disputes in science, and possibly we have particularly acute disputes in epidemiology?
So, and I think it's a really important point you're raising, and we see it everywhere, right? Like the really big place that you've seen it for years is in nutrition advice.
Yeah.
You know, if you eat fat, you're going to die horribly. Oh, actually, totally wrong. You're like, it just, and if you are a member of the public, you hear these very strong prescriptions. You have to do these things or else, and then complete reversals years later, right? Or competing ideas, right? And the flip side is that really opens us up to, sort of, pseudoscience and quasi-science. So, I think I have friends who are watching this Forks Over Knives video, and it is just the worst kind of junk science. It's not even junk science. It's like, it positions of a science, but like this idea that if you have to use a knife, it's going to kill you. It's demented. But in a world where scientists act very confidently with great certainty, and then are routinely being shown that they can be wrong, that's a real problem. And so that's a real, and the same thing with like prediction modeling, about like the last election. Oh, you guys are all wrong. Well, or maybe there's both a misunderstanding of what that modeling does and a presentation problem. So I think one thing we can do, and this is a philosophy of science issue, is we can start being more honest about how we need to be uncertain, and we're not right. And I think scientists as a culture sharing group ought to look at themselves very critically and start owning up to how we must be uncertain. So have you all ever heard of Richard Feynman? Famous, okay. I admire him greatly. He has some really amazing words on accepting uncertainty. He actually has some really interesting Cold War perspective too on democracy being more amenable to science because it accepts uncertainty, and sort of the Soviet system not being fascinating stuff. But I think it's really important that we start acknowledging that we don't have all the answers. We can be wrong. And I got to tell you, as someone who has strong theoretical commitments. So for example, in this data has killed science, data has killed theory debate, I feel very strongly that there is value in domain knowledge and in theory. And I think that is much a better idea for computer scientists and domain experts to crosstalk and to work together. But you know what? I could be wrong. Maybe there is enough data out there that data will one day trump all theory, in which case I'll have to shut my pie hole and be quiet and accept it. And I think I can do the best for the public and for decision makers to be pretty transparent and honest and say, we don't know the future. We don't know with certain, the best we can give you. And so if when you use the word rigor in research, and I teach a qualitative method course. So I teach in the Global Security Studies course at Johns Hopkins University. I teach a qual methods. It's really like a qual research design and methods course. And how do you teach people to be rigorous in qualitative methods? Kind of a challenge. And really, it's very much about transparency. Yeah. It's not hand waving and saying, well, I looked at the data and here's what I found. It's trying to walk your audience,
Mm-hmm.
who are very often, for these students who want to go into public policy issues very often, and are coming out of, they're military members, they work in the intelligence community, they work for State Department or in government. How do I help them not just do good quality work, but be able to explain with transparency how I got there, so that those who read their work or when they speak to decision makers, they can have a sense that this is not hand waving. And while I don't think that you're always right, I have confidence that you were transparent and fair with me in discussing what you did and didn't do.
It's very interesting you say that, Bill. Again, very rich. It makes me think of something a former RAND researcher once told me about, who worked on jury trials, about the difference between adversarial versus kind of inquisitorial approaches to seeking truth. And it seems like it's very interesting to hear you say, and we've talked about this in the past as well, about this idea of calibrating uncertainty. So if you think about weather forecasters, for example, it's great because they're always giving you probabilities. And there's a sense in which if a weather forecaster should be judged not on whether they're correct, but on how calibrated they are. So if they say that there's a 60% chance of rain, it doesn't matter whether it rains tomorrow or not. But 6 times out of 10, averaged over all of the predictions they're making, it should rain. But I'm curious from your perspective, because it feels like you're much closer to communicating this. I mean, it's easy for me to say that P equals 0.05 means 1 out of 20 should be wrong and we should be looking for those. But from your perspective of trying to communicate that to policymakers, you talked about visualization, you talked about all of these things. How do you communicate that uncertainty, and how do we communicate to each other and to the rest of the science community and to the world that it's okay?
Well, I think it starts with us deciding it's okay and being willing to expose ourselves in our published work that I am not. So I'm going to use I love analogies. I'm an analogy kind of guy. And I have another hat, this weird hat where I am involved in writing analytics. So I'm involved with educators. My academic little part of the world is the writing analytics world. I'm on the board of editors for the Journal of Writing Analytics. And I'm trying to bring, along with this other small group of people, to bring analytics to bear on writing instruction, which has been this like homebrew, handcrafted human endeavor for a long time. Can we inform writing instruction, right, and learning with analytics? I believe yes. And so let's say we bring analytics to bear on some student writing in classroom practice, and we do a kind of a scatter plot where we see how students are alike or unalike in their writing, okay? And I'm looking at this and I'm like, holy mackerel, you know, most of the students, if we looked at like, say, like certainty language, they're sort of clustered over here. The assignment, they're mostly like, have a certain range of certainty and hedging language. But like Johnny is like way up here to the right, like no hedging language and very, very certain. So it's one thing to notice that. It's another thing to ask Johnny, why are you doing that? He's like, well, I want to have a strong voice. I don't want to be weak. And to unpack with this student that in their mind, hedging language is a sign of weakness and bad writing. And to take that analogy back to your question, you know, am I a weak researcher if I say, I can't attribute this to Russian involvement? I think it is. I have a certain level of confidence in this. So my level of confidence comes from, you know, here are 4 criteria. It mentions and boosts Russian news sources is one criteria. A second one is it follows a known Russian TTP for disinformation. And I have these criteria, and I tell you, when we find a community in our data set where we see 3 out of those 4, any 4 criteria met, we have high confidence. I told you that I have confidence. I told you why I have it, and I admitted it's not perfect. And so the other flip side is editors for journals. I think people who are supervising and people who are teaching. You know, I think our example as teachers, and so all 3 of us are teachers, right? We're all teachers, right? I have this really strong pedagogical commitment to not being perfect for my students. One of the things I do in this class is I have them read my first published I published a journal article out of my dissertation, like all of us do, right? And I got to tell you, it's a little squirmy to look back at it, years later and go, yeah, that may not have been it's not bad, but it's like, oh. But being willing to show your students that I was that I had to learn, that there's a journey to expertise, that I wasn't always, and hey, guess what? Maybe in 20 years I'll be even better.
Yeah.
I think that is a cultural issue. And I don't know how to change culture other than us starting to do it and having a discussion about the implications of changing culture.
And that's very grand of you to do that, but it feels like exactly what we should be doing as teachers.
Humble of you to do it. Yeah.
And yeah, but it feels like if we can't do it, I used to work on this class at Berkeley, and probably my favorite lecture was when this Nobel Prize winner in physics would talk about a retraction and about how even somebody at that caliber was fooled by, they were looking for star signals and fooled by the camera. And so we're all fooled by these things, but it doesn't mean that you don't learn from them and develop new methods of checking yourself. And to your point about strength, I've often thought we should maybe go look at athletics, because anybody who's a successful athlete has the looseness in their limbs that is designed. If you look at football players, nobody's running with locked arms and locked legs saying, this is where I'm going. I mean, you bend your legs because you may have to dodge and you may have to move around a little bit. So I'm absolutely with you when you say that there has to be flexibility, but how do you convey that flexibility gives you strength? Maybe that's the difficult philosophical question.
Yeah, I think there's a confounding factor in that we are often competing as disciplines for prestige. So for me, the perfect example of this is neuroscience. Like I gag a little bit when I hear someone say neuroscience has shown. I just get really frustrated when I hear that. And there's a sort of an epistemological issue of privileging certain kinds, and we talked at the beginning, right? It's different approaches to knowledge. And the idea of privileging some approaches over others can be a real problem. And I think, so for example, fMRI evidence, like there's a lot of things bound up in there, right? One is presenting pictures as if they were photographs when they are not photographs. Like when a layperson sees a picture of, I don't know, an elephant on the savannah, there was actually an elephant there in the savannah, and it's pretty strong, good, credible evidence because you took a picture of it. It's hard to Photoshop it. You could do it, whatever, but like we often trust that kind of evidence. But if I show you a picture of part of the brain lighting up, first off, it didn't light up. There were no photons generated, right? Secondly, it's not a picture of the brain. It is a image generated probabilistically from a magnetic signal, right? And it goes to an algorithm, which, as we found out, we talk about software flaws. What if it turns out your algorithm had some serious computational problems in it, and the image generated really are a product of your algorithm, not of what happened in the brain? So, but the issue here is, what are the motivations and incentives for neuroscientists to say, yeah, actually, right, versus to say the data shows us or neuroscience has proven? And I don't know the answer to that one, right? Competing for resources as a scientist, in some ways we're all sort of at cross purposes as we compete for grant funds, as we compete for attention, that kind of thing.
This is so stimulating, Bill. I'm actually frustrated because there's so much we should be talking about, and we're going to have you back for more episodes. I think one episode should be a philosophy of science episode, because a lot of what you're talking about, the humility of science, and also the incentives for scientists to compete and then to pose as if they know everything. And then there are the funding streams and the political favor and all the other incentives that encourage that. That has concerned Aditya and I in other discussions a lot. So maybe we could address that in an episode.
And the other fundamental thing that you brought up, which we probably should postpone to a different episode, is how do you know when to trust your instruments? And it comes to what we were talking about with machine learning. We used to teach this thing by Ian Hacking, who's this philosopher of science, called interactive exploration. So why do we believe the pictures we take from our phone. I mean, how do you know that the grainy filter on Snapchat is not a machine learning algorithm, but rather shipping it off to somewhere else where some artist is making a trace sketch and then sending it back to you? And then it feels like at some level what science is going for is a sense of interactivity. So if I poke you and then I see the fMRI change, then there's more evidence. But the static image doesn't tell me anything. Similarly, if I put up a set of diffraction grading glasses over my eyes and then I look at the sun and I look at my lamp and I see something different, then I might start to believe it. So anyway, it's probably something to talk about later, but I'm very curious to see how we can think about the information that comes to us now is almost entirely filtered, whether it's through a machine learning algorithm, whether it's through Facebook's algorithm or Google's algorithm or what we see because of our computers or our GPS devices. And some of those clearly to me seem more reliable than others, but why?
Well, I think what we're coming back to again is that while robust decision-making has these real advantages in terms of applied research, right? We can identify these advantages for mitigating risk and for avoiding, catastrophic failure in our planning. It also does involve this philosophical issue of cultivating humility and having an air of uncertainty. I think, Bruce, you're right. Like, I value philosophy of science. I think it's really important. Some of my important coursework was in that area. I think a lot of us have read Thomas Kuhn, and okay, that makes some sense to us. And so I do think that we're going to find over and over again, many of the problems that we're identifying across a range of applications come back to some root issues. Mm-hmm. Like, have we constructed systems where we're competing rather than collaborating? Mm-hmm. Have we created a culture where, people are willing to cultivate humility? I will tell you on the side of the idea of instrument failure, mm-hmm. I depend on both algorithms, but more often I tend to be more in statistical description. So I use corpus methods. So I want to statistically describe, do keenness testing, do colloquial extraction using PMI, point visual information measure to see strength of two words being together. Mm-hmm. So I'm relying on a computer and software that I hope does not have produced terrible errors. Two, I am hoping there wasn't some weird problem in the data, transform, extract, load that made some weird thing happen. And now I'm looking at the data as being wrong. I hope that, the actual implementation of it in my particular setting is not wrong. And I got to tell you, I actually have nightmares sometimes. I have legitimate nightmares where I have published something and then realized it's all non-censoration. And it's a debilitating fear. And what I hope is that I would have the moral courage to be like, I was wrong. Here's how we got wrong and what we do about it. But boy, I don't want to be in that position.
I'll speak for myself and say I have experienced that myself. And that's probably a healthy fear. Right? Then we don't build an Imperial College model of pandemic spread, which is full of faked fixes.
And I wonder if that fear could go both ways. One, in the sense that hopefully it would motivate you to go for simpler models, as you were saying, Bill, that you actually understand, and that your nightmare helps you decipher the problem as opposed to just, oh my gosh, here's this forest, not ranting against random forest. But then on the other hand, it might lead some people to obfuscate even more and say, I'm going to say that it's all the fault of the machine, and especially if you're going towards general AI, well, I didn't make that decision. The machine did.
Right. And I think it's also somewhat close to this idea of data phishing. Yeah. When we think about the crisis of social sciences, where I don't have to worry about the robustness of my study design, right? It's a low power study. There's no real validity to my construct. I'm just looking around and fishing. And if I found something, I found it. And again, there's a kind of a disavowal there, because I can just go, instead of saying, I did rigorous intellectual work to build, and I mean, I believe that scientists fundamentally are model builders. I believe that our job is to build models of the world that we can then use usefully to do things, right? And I think it's really, so there's a guy named Gary Ryan at Rand. He's an old school qualitative guy, and he hates qualitative. He's like, that's just Jung. You know, everyone does mixed methods these days. What he argues, I think is kind of useful, is that a lot of us tend to be either doing exploratory work or confirmatory work. So very often when I'm working with my colleagues, say like, how do we model the will to fight? How do we do modeling and simulation of will to fight? Right. So there's real problem in simulations, combat simulations, where it's a quantitative problem. We tend to like to model and then simulate only those things that are countable, right? And that leads to some like very kooky stuff. Like that leads to things where like I could have like, say like Peshmerga, you know, Kurdish Peshmerga being overwhelmed by a force, you know, when actually in practice, these guys, you know, and gals fight to the death, right? They're braves. Or I can, you know, do a simulation where like, you know, Iraqi army like stands tall because they have you know, all these quantifiable measures, when in practice, you know, they like fold like wet cardboard, right? So if I want to do that, if I want to kind of like model in that way, I want to be able to bring to this, and I'm so terribly sorry, I lost train of thought, I'm embarrassed right now, but I have the humility to admit that I lost where I was going with that, so I apologize.
Well, a lovely example of displaying it in practice, which makes me wonder, I mean, Bruce, should we be thinking about how the individual, we've talked a lot about the policymaker, and I think there's so much here that we should come back to. But from the perspective of the individual, it seems to me that we're all scientists in some way, but that's a generalization. I don't really even like the term of separating scientists from non-scientists, because it feels like we all have the capacity for rational inquiry, and maybe some are more familiar with methods or tools, but that's just a question of tools. So how can we apply robust decision-making to our everyday lives, which of course also has an impact on our collective lives?
Sure. So I think most of us are used to predict then act modeling in our own lives. We don't use actual simulations. We don't actually use like databases, but I think most of us have been taught to think through what is the most plausible scenario for the future, and then to try and go ahead and optimize for that future. And I think all of us have seen that kind of thing go awry. And a really common one is when people try and make financial choices, they often think about what is probable and likely, launching a business, you know, or a career change. And I think the pandemic is a great example. And you've heard people talk about these sort of black swan events, which I'm not in love with the term, but I get the idea, right? What if something really unexpected happens and you've just made a decision? So for example, deciding that I'm going to launch a new business, but I don't have really big capital reserves. Mm-hmm. I'm really confident in my plan. I'm really confident I can make it work. And then you find out, I can only imagine how many nascent businesses were choked off and destroyed by this utterly unforeseen idea of an economic lockdown. Right? No one was thinking about that, but people launch businesses every day, and they haven't thought about what happens if it all goes wrong. So I do think we get one good thing, and that is we are often taught to ask our friends and neighbors and families about options. So we do have experience going to lots of our friends and saying, what do you think? What I would suggest is, rather than this habit of saying, what do you think is the most probable? Rather ask your friends and neighbors to think about sort of different like scenarios. What could go right? What could go wrong? What are sort of benefits? How do you mitigate things? And then, while we're not going to day to day have access to like robust modeling, that's not how it works. A lot of our friends and family and our associates, they're often very smart. They often have deep domain knowledge in a certain thing. Even people don't have big formal educations or deep formal educations, they may actually really know an area or a subject really, really well. Yeah. And to ask them about, well, how do you make sure this doesn't go wrong? Or how do you balance these things out? Or how do you choose between options? That's a way to get many, many cases from your network and then make a much better decision that is not an optimization decision.
Yeah, I suppose I will add, while Aditya thinks about that, I'll add, so Bill, you correctly said that people tend to think about what is probable. And they also think about what is improbable, right? So they like to categorize away things which they're going to assume are not going to happen. But they also like to think about what is optimal. So they will focus and they will overestimate on what they want to happen. So they have a positive risk bias.
Yes.
So they will pursue positive risks beyond correct estimations. So they will, if they think if they're going to invest in a business or start up a business, they tend to overestimate how likely it is to succeed. And we also have the flip side of that, which is overestimation of negative risks and to avoid positive risks because they are associated with negative risks. So somebody might say, I'm not going to start up a business because it could fail. And they're going to ignore a calculation, a trade-off between the positive risks, which is making money and building something constructive. They're going to just focus, it could fail, and they just focus on that. So there are these problems of focusing on things to the detriment of other calculations and trade-offs. So I'm just putting that out there. I don't know, Bill, if you want to give any advice to the layperson about how to think about those issues in everyday decision making.
So I think there's two things. One of them is, again, this idea of trying to get other people to help you think not about sort of what is optimal or what is probable, but to think through what is durable and robust across a range of possibilities. So what you described tends to lead to all or nothing thinking.
Yeah.
Start a business, don't start a business. It tends to close off the idea of, well, could I start a business on the side while I still go ahead and keep employment? Or could I maybe start a business while retaining, say, like part-time work over here? Or can I pool risk? So for example, can I find other people who want to start a business and we'll all share, say, some elements of it? But your creativity for mitigating risk goes away the moment you go to these, all or nothing, yes or no binary choices. So then a second thing is when we think about public policy issues, and we see them every day, like if you're on Facebook, if you're on any kind of social media, you see your friends, thinking about sort of when they argue about what we should do, when they are happy or unhappy about a politician's statements, they're really talking about their belief about the future. Conditions now and in the future. I think things are this way, and now I'm thinking about what will come about based on my preferred solutions. And if we could be a little lighter about our assumptions, and I'm not going to mention current events because they're so fraught, right? But I want to maybe step back to something historical. And that is, you'll remember in the 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, this movement towards teacher accountability, right? There's this really important problem that is, what about outcomes for students and disparate outcomes? I think it's very legitimate for policymakers and for the public to really care about how come some kids are getting left behind in school, right? That's a very legitimate question, perfect example of public policy inquiry. And the thing is, if you were really sure of your priors, if you just know in your tummy that the problem is some of those teachers are lazy and they're not doing a good job, and teacher unions, and we don't hold teachers accountable anymore, and you sort of start with what you know is true, which is a very unscientific perspective, think about the kinds of investments you might make. Like you might invest billions of dollars in creating statewide testing for grades in teacher accountability program. I mean, you might make these massive investments and then find out when you have more data later on that actually your zip code might be more important than, testing or who your teacher was. What you might find out is that things like what do families look like in your neighborhood look like and have an impact on that kind of thing. And the idea that you found out post hoc that not only did I waste billions of dollars, I also maybe didn't help anybody. There's opportunity cost of time. So I guess my advice is when you know in your heart that your preferred solution will lead to your preferred future, is to hold that lightly, to realize that just like scientists, when we think about like what to do about problems in the public sphere, we don't know the future and we are often not experts. So can we instead maybe find common ground? So I would love, as we talk about, sort of responses to these really contentious issues that are in the news right now, can we think about solutions that cover many possibilities, not my preferred one? Actually, I have a question for you guys. So you are risky scientists. You are interested in risk mitigation, risk management, and sort of like making good decisions. Has your exposure in this limited talk to RDM, what has that thought spurred for you all? What would you do differently? How would you incorporate it? What do you think now? What are your reactions?
Ooh, that's a fascinating question. I think even off the cuff, I really like this concept of thinking about covering the most ground, as you've described it, across a possible range of futures. Actually, I've been seeing a lot of, we've all been seeing them with our respective universities. But interestingly, all the universities that I'm paying attention to have all published guidelines for reopening based on scenario planning. And I thought that was actually quite refreshing. I did not expect that. I expected more confidence from the administration of this is how the pandemic is going to go out. And it was nice to see that they're thinking about a range of options. And perhaps the most interesting one, though, Bill, that you bring up from a personal perspective is you see these Facebook debates, right? You see these inbuilt conversations that maybe seem like things that are absurd or irritating, but it does feel like it's going to play out in the course of our futures. And having those debates, and I'm now finding myself thinking, how can you structure a conversation such that at the very outset of a debate like this, you have the range of possible futures laid out in front of you, whether that's a visualization, whether that's a tool, I don't know. That feels like maybe the hardest thing. Is just that it's very hard for us in our mind to picture two disparate ideas at once. I think there's a Fitzgerald quote that says pretty much that the sign of first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two ideas at once in your head that don't quite agree. And I'm paraphrasing there, but that's my initial takeaway. Bruce?
Yeah, so I think it's refreshing. I think the word I will add is it's kind of liberating to think in robust decision-making terms, particularly from a risk management perspective, because in risk management, our default process is to calculate the risk. So we want to estimate the probability, we want to estimate the outcomes of the contingency, we want to multiply those two things and calculate the risk. And then we will decide what we're going to do about it. So then we're going to manage the risk after we've assessed the risk. And I think robust decision-making is quite liberating in saying, before you assess the probabilities of these scenarios, or even you may just not assess the probabilities at all, we can just list the scenarios or the contingencies and try to find a policy that prepares us for as many of those contingencies as possible. And after that point, you might put probabilities on it to tighten up your policy response. So that's what I find very liberating about your approach, Bill. And I very much appreciate you describing, articulating it so clearly and stimulating in such a stimulating way. Like I say, I'm now really excited to have some more episodes with you where we could explore further a lot of the issues that we've raised. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, and I'd love to come back, and I'm going to send you all, and these are not my methods, right? These are developed at RAND and promulgated by RAND and getting more and more spread, but they're not mine. But I will send you some links to hopefully some stuff sort of educational, some examples, and put those in the notes for the podcast. But it's been a great conversation, and I found it really stimulating. It made me think. So I look forward to more conversations.
That's
well, thank you so much.
We'll make that happen.
Okay.
Well, we are the risky scientists.
We are. Thank you, Bill. Goodbye.
Thank you.